have to
We
take
haven't-
care of business first. It's our
That's
first
right.
meeting,
That's
yes.
right, I forgot.
Yes. A meeting of the Pennichuck Water Special Committee is being held today, Thursday, March 14th, at 7 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. Let's start the meeting by taking a roll call attendance. That will be me. Okay. Alderman Moran?
Here.
Alderman Jettie?
Here.
Alderman Govea?
Here.
Alderman O'Brien has said that he was going to be unable to make it, and he wanted to give his apologies to the Pennichuck personnel, that he always enjoys being here. So, and Alderman Klee is here. We have enough for quorum. Also in attendance is Don Ware and George Torres from Pennichuck. First order of business is election of a clerk. Alderman Govea has volunteered and said that he would like that. Are there any others named? Any others named? Did someone want to nominate him?
I nominate
Okay.
Alderman Govea for clerk.
Alderman Moran has nominated Alderman Govea.
I'd like to make a motion to close nominations.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just going to ask for that. Okay, and I guess I
All
just
those in
close, well, I do have to vote on the closed nominations. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? And that motion carries. Alderman Moran, did you want to make a motion to elect?
Yeah, I make a motion to elect Alderman Govea as the clerk of this
Okay.
meeting.
I'm trying to write all this down quickly. Okay, all those in favor of that motion? Aye.
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 And those opposed? And that motion carries. Alderman Govea, would you like to grab your nameplate and come on over? And while
Thank
he's,
you, Alderman Govea.
I always like volunteers. Because
I came here prepared to nominate Alderman Jettie.
I was gonna say, poor Alderman O'Brien may have had to have been the, because, you know, you always pick on the one who's not here, right? Okay, let's get started. Public comment? Seeing no one here, none. Communications?
There is none.
Unfinished business?
None.
New business resolutions?
R-24-023, authorizing Pennichuck Corporation to renew and extend its line of credit with TD Bank.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to invite Mr. Ware and Mr. Torres, if you wouldn't mind coming up. And before we get started, I know everybody's always constantly changing, so if you wouldn't mind giving your name and your title before we have this discussion.
I don't think there's been a change in a long time.
Well, Larry retired last
Right, but
December.
that's the first time there's been a change.
That was the first time, yeah.
In
yeah.
a long time.
Well, prior to that, there was a couple of shifts of Larry's position was kind of like chopped up and moved around, and everybody's
Yes,
titles were changing.
Larry
correct?
was my predecessor. Good evening, my name is George Torres. I'm the CFO and treasurer of Pennichuck Corp. and its subsidiaries, its 5 subsidiaries. I took over the role back in 2020, the end of 2022. Larry had both roles as CEO, as CFO. I've been with the company now since 2006. I've kind of worked my way through and assumed this position now going on almost 2 years. And to my right is obviously Don Ware, COO, who I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. And happy to answer any questions you guys may have.
And Don, if you could just give your,
All right, my name's Donald Ware. I'm Chief Operating Officer and have been such since 2004. Been with Pennichuck since 1995, so I've been around the block a few times. and-
yeah. Don is my go-to person for the history. I sat and listened to him one day to just discuss even the reservoir up in,
Up off at the end of Columbia Ave.
Exactly.
Reservoir Street.
yeah, exactly where Reservoir Street was. It was very interesting, and I'm not making light of it, trust me. I love the history of everything of this city. So if I don't know which one of you is going to speak to this resolution.
So, thank you for having us this evening. So what we're requesting is the approval of this committee on the PCP, Pennichuck Corporation, existing line of credit with TD Bank. It's been in existence now, I would say, since about 2013, I believe, with TD Bank. It is now at a $4 million level and has been for, I would say, at least 6 years now. That line of credit is a backstop, not only for PennCorp, but for the 5 subsidiaries. It is a 2-year agreement. It expires in June 30 of this year. The term sheet that was offered up by TD is exactly the same in shape and form as the prior arrangements, just with an extension for an additional 2 years. Well, let me back up a little bit. The one change you may notice is the calculation of the interest. It used to be, I believe, 1.5 plus prime plus the LIBOR rate. And now LIBOR is no longer in existence. It is now using the SOFR rate. But in totality, that agreement, or at least that term sheet, is exactly as the one currently in existence with PennCorp.
Okay. Before we continue also, I think, wasn't it, I think was it last year or sometime in mid-year that it was discussed that we were going to move from the LIBOR to the SOFR?
Yes, we
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
We did.
But if, for those that are listening and for new members to the board, if you could kind of explain what the SOFR is.
LIBOR, it was the benchmark rate that the banks use, and it's typically a rate that's used that they determine what the short-term borrowing rate would be. I'm trying to remember what it stood for, but they now have converted over to a SOFR rate. It's 1.5 plus SOFR, and the SOFR is a daily rate that's set. Basically, that determines what their borrowing rate will be internally, and then they set an additional interest rate on top of that. So right now, it's 1.75 on top of whatever the SOFR rate will be. The SOFR rate's a floating rate. Think of it the way as like a line of credit is. It may change, be calculated daily, weekly, monthly. It's the same premise here with a 1.5% increase on top of that.
So for those of you who love.
If you could
Google-
just say your name and.
Don Ware from Pennichuck Water. For those of you who love Google, what does SOFR stand for? It's this secured overnight financing rate, and it's set by the Federal Reserve.
Correct.
And so it's not set by the banks
No.
or anything else. So it's something that, you know, again, relative to an agreement like this, it's a benchmark that the banks are glued to.
Okay, thank you. Did anybody have any questions? Alderman Moran.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Forgot to do that.
That's
Do we
okay.
have any idea if there's a cap on that, or what the Fed has set it? Is this the overnight thing where they park money at the Fed?
So, as Don had explained, that SOFR rate is set by the Treasury. They could basically set the rate at whatever it is. And then the banks will just apply basically a sweetener on top of it. That 1.5% is basically their margin on top of what they would have to pay. So that SOFR rate is basically what banks are paying internally to transfer funds between institutions. And then for external borrowers, then they apply a 1.5% increase on top of it. And that's basically, in effect, their margin or their interest, their cost for you to do that borrowing.
Follow up.
Yes, please.
Do we have an idea what the average SOFR rate has been for maybe the last 30
Our
days?
Treasury, I mean, you're probably talking somewhere, and again, if, look it up, probably in the 2s or 3s, somewhere
Okay,
around
all right.
there.
So, sorry.
That's okay.
In
No, please,
totality,
go ahead.
less than 5%.
Oh, yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
certainly,
Thank you.
certainly, oh, yeah.
And this basically is the same agreement that we've had year after.
It's
Yeah.
exactly the same in shape or form, just the underlying benchmark rate has changed.
Any other questions? Alderman Jettie?
I heard you say it was 1.5% plus the SOFR rate, and then at some point you said 1.75. What,
I think 1.75 was the prior agreement. It was, if I remember this correctly, it may change from renewal to renewal. I believe it's at 1.5. I'll have to look at it now, but you know, if it's at 1.75, that's set by the bank.
So the SOFR rate, and again, a little dated, but March 13th, 2024 was 4.939%.
Yeah, so it was pretty high.
At one point, it was pretty close to zero
Yep.
for a long time, but
Okay,
change in cost of capital these days.
we're all feeling it. Any other questions?
Thank you. And what is how much of the 4 million line of credit have you borrowed at this point? in
Right now,
time?
we're at zero.
Oh.
We're at zero. Now, this line of credit is a backstop for all of the entities. So what'll happen is typically based on an algorithm set at the bank, they'll look at our cash levels and then they'll look at our outstanding payables. Depending on what that algorithm says, it will do an automatic draw to cover our outstanding payables. We ended the year in 2023 out of the line of credit, which is certainly a good thing. We did dip into it briefly earlier this year for about a few $100,000. When I looked at the last cash report, we're currently out of it. And we are projected by year's end to be
Yeah.
into the line of credit. Not, I would say probably less than half of what it is right now. But, it is basically just a backstop. It's not something that we ordinarily would look for any particular specific need.
Alderman Jettie? Do you have any
Yeah,
other follow-up?
no, thank you. No, that answers.
I'm sorry, please.
That answers that question.
Okay,
I did have
continue, no, please.
So I'm new to the committee, and, but I'm under the impression, and if you could please confirm this, that the city is not a guarantor of this
No, it's not.
loan, correct?
No, it's not.
Okay.
We just have to seek the city's approval in order to enter an agreement to renew. And as a matter of fact, any obligation that the company may enter into, we have to seek your approval.
Yeah, the thing that's been made very clear is that as the sole shareholder, the only thing that we technically do is we approve the items such as this. So we approve any kind of indebtedness they could possibly get into loans, et cetera. And I believe your board members are
Correct.
technically the only real power that we have over the Pennichuck. The PUC sets the rates and so on. But all your assets and so on, as well as your liabilities, are within the Pennichuck.
For lack of a better description, the city holds the purse strings when it comes to
Yeah,
paying.
that's basically, but only purse string to indebtedness. We can't say what you can and cannot
Correct.
buy. We can only say what you can and cannot borrow.
Correct.
And just maybe one point of
Sure,
clarification. As
please.
George has indicated, this is what's called a working capital line of credit. And it's used when, revenues don't cover expenses. We have two sources. Because we're regulated, we are not allowed to have cash reserves. So we're allowed to we have a $5 million cash reserve, which was actually bonded for by the city when they acquired the stock. And that sits there, and we go into that and out of that during the winter months. Expenses always exceed revenues. It's during the summer months, if you have a hot, dry year, which you usually have it, revenues exceed expenses, but the revenues are targeted through rate making to be the same as the expenses. And so, typically in the past, winter months, we might have been into that working capital line of credit. Once this RSF fund was established, that's a place where we typically go first. Rate cases are 3 years apart typically. We've been 3 years out on our last rate case. And so towards the end of this year, between the length of time since our last rate case, which allowed us revenues to cover the expenses as they were incurred in 2020, that in combination with last year's lovely, not
Rainy.
hot, dry summer.
Rainy.
We actually barely sold more water than we do typically during the winter time. And it was a huge
Yeah.
impact from a revenue perspective. And we're a 90% fixed cost, 10% variable cost business, but over half our revenues come from variable sales. So when your variable sales drop off by 20%, It does some pretty nasty things to, your income statement.
We're praying for no rain this summer, or at least for Pennachuck.
And one other thing, in the interest of full disclosure, and I just realized I didn't touch upon this, there's, in addition to the SOFR and the rate that they charge on top of that, there is an unused line fee associated with this as well. So whenever we are out of the line, there is a calculated unused fee based upon whatever that, if it's a zero balance at the end of the month, then they calculate, and there's a fee that is charged for just being able to access that account. So I just wanted to, add that point of clarification as well.
Alderman Jettie, did you have another question?
No, I'm saying,
Okay.
thank you.
I know I'm confusing all of the different accounts that you have. I do recall at some meetings, there are certain accounts that you have to zero out by the year's end, or?
Well, these, we have, last count, about 26 bank accounts, 27 bank accounts, more than I care to admit. With the exception of the checking accounts, most of these accounts are zero ZBA accounts, so they're zero balance accounts, which will sweep into the corporate operating account. I believe that is what you're referring to.
I think so we have what's called, for Pennachuck Waterworks,
Right,
a fixed asset line of credit. What is that? That's the money that we borrow during the year
Right.
to do our capital improvements. That's a $12 million
she's talking about
fixed
Yeah.
asset
The
line of
cleanout
credit.
provision, the cleanout provision.
We
Cleanup,
could,
yes.
we have to pay that down to zero every year. So 2023, we spent $9.23 million on capital improvements. We borrowed from the FALAC that $9.23 million in April of this year. We'll be going to the bond market, selling enough bonds to pay for that $9.23 million. That'll be taken, and that will pay off that fixed asset line of credit. And at that point, since what we're paying off is for assets that are now considered to be used and useful, they're being used by the customers, they're not construction work in progress, we're able to recover the cost of the debt associated with that in rates. But that's what has
That's
to
what I
be
was
cleaned
thinking
out
of,
once a
yes.
year, it has to be zeroed out, so
Yeah.
we'll, April 26th, I think, is the target
What-
date, or April 22nd for the sale this year of bonds.
The 22nd, I believe, and then those proceeds will be used to clean out the
to
FALAC.
clean up.
Yeah, and I do apologize for not understanding your question, because now I remember, we did come in front of this committee last year for
Yeah.
the approval of the PWW
Right,
FALAC, which Don is referring to. That is the $12 million facility at PWW, as Don has so eloquently described, is what the company leverages for their annual capital expenditures at PWW. That later gets cleaned out with the annual bonding. That has a 30-day cleanout provision in it. It's within any calendar period, so there's really is, whether we clean it out at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year, it's really irrelevant. We always shoot for the beginning of the year, because once the bonds, we get the proceeds from the bonds, then we then clean out the FALAC.
right. Now that I've muddied the waters, does anybody else have any other questions? If not, oh, sure. Yes, I was gonna say, I was gonna ask you to make a motion.
never actually made the motion.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you to make a motion, I noticed I hadn't written it
I'll make
yet.
a motion to recommend final passage of R-24-023.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? And that measure carries. Alderman, Mr. Clerk.
Next order of business, R-24-024, authorizing Pennachuck Corporation and Pennachuck East Utility Incorporated to enter into a term loan with Co-Bank. I'll make a motion to recommend final passage.
Thank you. And this is gonna be, I assume, similar to the previous one.
Yeah, so let me muddy the waters a little bit
It's
more
okay,
now.
good, please.
So with PEU, PEU is obviously one of the three regulated subsidiaries under PennCorp. And PEU has very limited access to external financings. One of the entities that is available to PEU is an entity called CoBank, which is a cooperative. I believe they're based out of the Midwest. We have a $4 million FALAC, similar, it operates pretty similarly to it does in PWW. Obviously, it's a much smaller level. That PEU Faylock does not have a cleanout provision. However, the company does clean it out on an annual basis and reterms it through a term loan, which is what we're requesting approval for now, in the amount of $2.1 million. So what that $2.1 million represents is the amount of capital that was expended last year in PEU, which is then returned into, I believe, a 25-year note for PEU. The rate escapes me right now.
It would be about 7.5%.
Yeah, it's about 7.5, which is typically higher than what you would see at PWW, but based on their size and their structure, that's the availability. That rate is what's applicable to that type of loan for PEU. So we're looking for approval into entering that agreement as well.
Thank you. Are there any questions on this? Sure, Alderman Jettie.
So on this one, this is a loan that Pennachuck East Utility, Inc. is taking with CoBank, and Pennachuck Corporation is guaranteeing that loan?
If I look at the guarantee, it is not of the stock. I'd have to go back and look at, see what the arrangement is for PEU on the CoBank.
But you think PennCorp does guarantee
But
that-
not, it guarantees it, but not, there isn't
Right,
a
not
stock
at this-
pledge.
right.
It isn't a stock pledge. If I'm remembering that agreement, it could be under the assets of PEU, but again, I'd have to go back and look. But effectively, PCP is guaranteeing that loan, correct?
Okay, and so in that regard, is there, I'm not sure exactly what Pennachuck East, what towns it covers, but are you confident that they are able to generate enough income to pay this loan so that Pennachuck is not at risk at all?
This term loan, similar to other term loans with CoBank, is covered under their DSRR portion of their revenues, which basically means there's a portion of their revenues that's allocated to different buckets. The DSRR, which is a debt service requirement, this term loan would fall under that. So we are able to recoup a portion of that to cover these loans. There's also the annual QC pack process that we go through on an annual basis that covers any capital that was placed in service that we assumed debt for the prior year. There's a portion of that we get in our rates on an annual basis that covers the payments on those loans as well. I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
elaborate on
it's
that.
very simply put, the rates are adjusted annually, in this case at Pennachuck East Utilities, to cover the principal and interest associated with this long-term debt. So the PUC comes in, they audit our books. In this case, they're looking at the capital that went in last year. They confirm, yep, you spent $2.1 million. It's all in plant. It's being used and useful, new hydrants, new water mains, new treatment systems, replace well pumps, 2.1 million. They give us the right to borrow that 2.1 million from CoBank. Once the loan is signed, they then adjust the rates at that time to the customers of Pennachuck East up by a small percentage on their base rate to cover the principal and interest and the property taxes associated with the plant that went in. Similar mechanism in PWW. The last year, as I mentioned, we spent $9.2 million. The bonds we're going to sell in April immediately start clocking interest and principal obligations, and the PUC is checked off and said yes in Pennachuck Waterworks and its various systems that Pennachuck Waterworks operates and owns. You spent $9.2 million. You're allowed to go ahead and sell the bonds. Will allow you to raise the rates by 1.42%, or in this case, it's actually 1.36% to recover the principal and interest and property taxes associated with that plant that's now in service. So there's a rate mechanism that allows, instead of waiting every 3 years when you would adjust operating expenses, to allow you to recover the capital on any debt that's issued for plant and equipment necessary to operate the utility.
So, quite often we'll hear they haven't had a rate increase in 3 years or something of that nature, but yet people will see that their rate actually changes, and that variable kind of changes because of these loans. Once we get through this, I'm gonna ask some questions of you gentlemen to kind of give a little bit of history, and I should have done that at the beginning, but Alderman Jettie, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Do you have any other questions?
No, no, it sounds like there's really no risk that our approving this doesn't put Pennachuck at any risk. It seems like it's all, the PUC makes sure that you're gonna be able to charge enough to cover the loan, and that, there's really there's no risk to the, we as a stockholder don't have to worry about our asset being diminished at all by this loan.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. The PUC is the one who is really kind of your governing, watching over every step that you make, every penny that you spend, every dollar that you become. My take, and please again correct me if I'm wrong, is that if they kind of ran amok and decided to try to do all these things, and suddenly they're having to push that rate up so high, they have a potential of losing customers, which in the end would not be a good thing. So they're very careful about it, and we're very careful about, and that's kind of why we have this oversee of seeing this, is so that, and they would never do that, but just so that they don't kind of take that train down and go, let's do all new pipes this year, 36 miles of pipes and so on. I
So
mean,
in
the market could not bear that.
Right,
yet.
in the regulatory mechanism, any capital expenditure that's in excess of $100,000 has a filing associated with it. That's the first crack at the PUC to say, nah, we don't think you should spend $400,000 to replace the water main on Foss Avenue.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to tell you that in the, now almost 30 years I've been at the company, we have never had a capital investment rejected by the Public Utilities Commission as being, done incorrectly. It's always been found to be correct. And in fact, one of the challenges with anybody, municipalities, water companies, is that we all have aging infrastructure. And the cost of replacing aging infrastructure, when you replace a water main that went in 1888, it's no longer has any cost to the ratepayer. And oh, by the way, when it went, it's not on the books, it's fully depreciated. But now in the city, it costs us almost $500 a lineal foot to put in water main. Yeah. And so, when you put in down a 500-foot long street, you're spending $250,000, and there may be 10 homes on that street. So you got to be very selective in where and when, but also understand that it has to be a continual process. And that has been a continual process since I arrived in 1995, is making sure that we make intelligent investment and we don't get behind the 8 ball. I will say, as a result, our rates are a little higher than some communities, but those communities are, the infrastructure is ready to fall apart. And so our approach has always been to, make prudent investment in infrastructure in a timely fashion. And that is a challenge when you look at the fact that we have $288 million worth of plant in the ground. And so, and a lot of it you can't see, and trying to gauge where it is and when to replace it before you have a major problem. It's an ongoing process, and the overlay is trying to, make the investment but keep rates as reasonable as possible. Rates could always be lower. Don't make any investment at all. But at some point, future generations pay heavily for that. When a bridge collapses because nobody did something with the bridge, so it's a challenge we all face. And as our shareholder, you're a partner to so you're borrowing money to do what is it done? Well, again, the good news is we're not making those decisions in a vacuum. The PUC reviews every one of those investments and decides whether they're prudent or not, and whether they're useful or not. And that's, again, all these loans that every year, we're gonna be coming to you for, loans to fund capital improvements in Pennachuck East or Pennachuck Waterworks. And as a regulated entity, we would love to have a cache of money over here sitting in a reserve to cover our operating expenses, but we're only allowed $5 million, which is only a 36-day reserve.
Okay.
We only have 36 days of working capital. But we're regulated, that's all we can have, and as a result, we need that backstop of that working capital line of credit when can only do rate cases every 3 years, and the revenues we get out of a rate case are based on the first year that the rates were generated. And unfortunately, expenses tend to go up. Power and chemicals in particular, over the last 2 years, have skyrocketed. One example, and it's what the city has to charge, our cost of sludge, what we discharge from the from the water treatment plant to the wastewater treatment plant, has tripled in the last 5 years. It used to be about a $300,000 a year expense. This year will be over $1 million. But that's what it costs the city to process the sludge. Well, when you talk about the fact is that just has to turn around and you have to build that into rates. Our chemical costs have gone from 1.2 to $2.6 million in the last 3 years. Same chemicals, same usage pattern, but challenge we all face.
As one of the things my predecessor and Don has talked about before, the company doesn't earn an equity return. Basically, what we earn in our revenues just covers what Don had mentioned. Our operating expenses and our capital investments, that's it. That's all we get within our rates. The only ability the corporation has, a little bit of equity, is out of the service company, if at all. But there is no equity return, so there isn't an incentive to be imprudent in these cases. So hopefully that answers your question.
Did that answer your question?
Yes,
Any
thank
further
you.
question? Oh, Alderman Moran.
Thank you.
And just to kind of, and I apologize for interrupting you, but once we finish doing this, I'm going to ask that you kind of give an overview of Pennachuck and how the city does and the city's loan purchase and so on. So, but Alderman Moran.
I just have a comment to put in maybe perspective for some folks. I didn't know that about the 36-day cash reserve. That's interesting because Department of Health and Human Services in New Hampshire, maybe all state requirements, like if you bid on an RFP for a DHHS contract, you have to have 90 days of cash reserve in order to be even, considered. So that's a tight budget that you're operating on there.
Are there any other questions regarding R24024? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed? And that motion carries. If you guys, excuse me, Mr. Torres and Mr. Ware, if you'll indulge me, one of the things that I found very interesting was to kind of, people will say to us all the time, and I've made Larry go through this millions of times, we own them. No, we're the mayor, actually, by the way. It's not the city. It's the mayor of the city who is the shareholder. There's one stock, that's it, and he is, or one share, and he owns that. The city fronted a loan in order
Point
to
of
purchase
order.
it. Sure.
Should we skip over new business and just go right into
Yes,
general
before we
discussion?
get to new business, I just want to kind of explain
So we
this.
can have this general conversation?
Okay, we
Yeah,
could
you
just,
wanna have-
we'll have the general discussion, sure. New business?
There's none.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's okay. No, that's fine. Yes, we'll get to, we'll be a general discussion now, so I'm going to ask if we could, if you could kind of explain that whole kind of, Mr. Ware, I know you've been around
Yeah.
for a while, so.
So I think.
And I have to apologize from this point, when we speak, we're gonna have to ask you, because those that are doing the transcription don't recognize your voices
All right.
yet. So if you just say your name, they say name and address, but just give me your name.
So this is Mr. Ware speaking. So I think we'll give you a quick history. We're always interested in educating not only our owner as the city, as shareholder, but all of our ratepayers as to who we are. Because prior to 2012, we were an investor-owned utility that was started in 1852. We had publicly traded stock on the NASDAQ. And we were operated, you know, in particular, if you understand it, an investor-owned utility makes its profit, makes its ability to pay its dividend from a return on equity. So when it invests in plant and equipment, a healthy utility does about 50% of that with debt, which they get back essentially dollar for dollar in the rates. But on the equity side, equity comes from who? It comes from your shareholder. Somebody's bought your stock. They can never come to you and say, well, in an initial public offering, I gave you $100,000 to buy stock, I want it back. No, they need to sell that stock to somebody else. But they bought that stock expecting to get a dividend. They made an investment. So that $100,000 gets invested in plant. And then, you know, in the old world, we were generally allowed, and there's a difference between allowed and what you actually earn, a pre-tax return on that equity of a little over 16%. It's a pretty healthy return, not guaranteed, but so if half your capital was being done and the cost of the ratepayer pre-tax was 16% and half of it was debt at 5%, your overall cost of capital was 10.5%, half of 16%, half of 5%. And so the city got looking at that, and there was a number of things. The company for itself was an unfiltered surface water supply from 1852 until 1982. In the revisions to the Safe Drinking Water Act that actually were formalized in 1986, they said if you have an unfiltered surface water supply, you have to filter it now unless you meet certain criteria, so much land ownership, so on and so forth. So you still have large communities, like the city of Boston gets their water from Quabbin Reservoir. It's unfiltered. The city of New York gets their water, and now my brain's getting fried. But what's
Hudson.
no, they get it from, they have a large, you know, protected area. It's unfiltered water. And it'll come to me as we're talking. But back at that time, we had to build a plan. And as a small company at the time, we couldn't raise the 50% equity by going out in the stock market. We just were too small, couldn't generate interest in an initial public offering at the stage. And so the company at that time had 2,000 plus acres of land. They said, well, if we have to build a filtration plant, you know, we don't need all this land to protect the water quality, so we're gonna start selling that land off. And that was the formation of the Southwood Corporation. That between 1985 and, up into the early 2000s, took land that was further back, it was within the watershed, but consider, okay, we can develop this if we do it wisely and we put in stormwater control, so on and so forth. And so, you know, during that land was sold off to generate equity, to invest in the company, to allow the company to meet its 50% debt equity match, and to generate a dividend. Well, as the late 90s evolved and things went on, the Safe Drinking Water Act changed again and said, you know what, one of the criteria for what you have to do to the water is how good your raw water is. Well, the development, the best raw water comes off of undeveloped land. And a lot of the undeveloped land at that stage had been developed or was in development. And that's when I think the city first got its interest. There was concerns raised by people within the city as to, gee, the company's selling off land, and at the end of the day, the shareholders getting the profits from this, and our rates are going up more. And wouldn't it make more sense that if the city could own, or if the company, instead of funding its capital needs with a mix of debt and equity, did 100% debt, wouldn't that be better? Well, again, just think about the numbers we said. With a 50-50 debt equity mix with a 5%, your cost of capital average was 10.5%. If you did it with 100% debt, it's only 5%. So it made sense. Hey, look, there's a good way that we can save money here. But, again, politics of the day, issues, it kind of quieted down, although there was a lot of people who were concerned about the company selling land, especially after the Safe Drinking Water Act sold. although they'd gone through studies and said, well, this is critical land, never sell that. That was about 500 acres, but this 1,500 acres, we can go ahead and sell and generate equity. Then in 2002, again, the company, relatively small, was unable to get into the equity markets. The board made a decision to sell the company. And at the time, we went out and we did dog and pony shows with United Water, with then Philadelphia Suburban, with United Water, to see if anybody was interested in purchasing the company. And in fact, Philadelphia Suburban, now Aqua America, stepped up and said, sure, we'd love to buy you. They actually came and there was a merger that was proposed. They came and met with the city to, try to get the city on board. This was 2002, 2003. And between a number of different reasons, I won't point fingers, and it was the best thing that could have happened, but at that stage, the city said, no, we're not okay with Philadelphia owning us. First of all, who are we gonna call when we have a problem? And at that stage, by the way, Philadelphia Suburban was a third owned by a French firm called Veolia. Think about it, 2002, 2003, foreign ownership. So the city then said, we're gonna take you over by we're gonna file an eminent domain case. We're gonna, we have a right under state law to own at least the facilities within Nashua, and maybe the facilities outside of Nashua. Once the city flashed the eminent domain card, Philadelphia Suburban said, we're not interested, we don't wanna get into a fight, and they left. Interestingly enough, the city said, great. They went away, go ahead, we like our little water company, we know how to get a hold of the president, keep going on. Well, the board, for its part, said, that's business interference. We have no opportunity to do anything. You're holding us hostage. Tough, what are you gonna do about it? So the company sued the city and said, either do the eminent domain or get out of our way. So the city's hand was forced. So 2004, the city filed the eminent domain case. And that case took 4 years, and between both parties, took $13.5 million of legal fees. And I'm gonna bite my tongue, and I'm not gonna say anything more about that. But at the end,
There's nothing wrong with legal fees, by the way.
By the way, Alderman Jettie is a lawyer.
no, I'm not saying, but I'm just saying that there was a lot of fees racked up legitimately, but at a
He has a
huge
good sense
cost,
of
and
humor
for,
anyway, so.
and for what? At the end of the day, the PUC in 2008 came out with a decision that was like the Solomon decision. They split the baby and came up with a decision that both parties were not happy with. They said, oh, city, you're right, you can take the facilities in Nashua and the adjoining communities that are directly piped. Price is $203 million, but when you take the heart out of the monster, you leave all these foundling communities out there that now have to reestablish a new utility, and you're gonna pay for $43 million in restitution so that, the remaining entities don't have to have rates go up, so on and so forth. So $243 million. From a shareholder perspective, the city paid that money, and it was gonna be subject to, at the shareholder level, the capital gains, because it was gonna be a pretty good premium on the stock trading price at the time, and the shareholders said, but we're not getting enough of a premium. So both parties walked off, both parties came back, we went to Superior Court first, and then Supreme Court, and the Superior Court and Supreme Court said, nope, PUC got it right. At that stage, both parties were looking at one another, now 2010 timeframe, and said, we gotta figure this out. Because the city has obvious interest, the company has obvious interest, and so we sat down and negotiated for a year to come up with a settlement that allowed the city, through a special legislative fiat, to purchase the stock of the company, but the company remained private, and the large reason it remained private is the other 43 communities that we serve all said, and they're just little parts of communities, wait a minute, if we have a problem, we're gonna pick up the phone and call our Nashua alderman? We have no control over them, they have no reason, and oh, by the way, once Nashua takes over, they're not gonna invest in our little systems anymore, they're just gonna forget us, and that was a concern of Merrimack and others. So at the end of the day, during the process of the city acquiring the stock, was gonna stay a private company. We're gonna be regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, but we're gonna be 100% debt financed. We're not gonna, there's no, if there is a year where, according to GAAP, we have a bottom line, that doesn't go to anybody. It goes there so that when our revenues don't cover our expenses, it comes back out. It will add to that $5 million reserve fund. That's though always get, at each rate case, if we've got more money in that fund than we're supposed to have because we had a couple good years, like we did in 2021, we reduced the amount of revenues that we collected for 3 years by $433,000 a year to give back the $1.2 million that had been collected in excess of the $5 million over that cycle. So, long story short, when the city took over, there was a real concern by the Public Utilities Commission and by the outside communities, the Litchfields, Londonderrys, Pelhams, Wyndhams, Merrimacs, who had all intervened and said, we don't want the city to, have control over the improvements that are made and the things that go on. But oh, by the way, the city has a real vested interest in the viability of the company because it borrowed $150.2 million to buy our stock. And, to pay the shareholder $5 million of which was reserved out to establish this $5 million reserve fund. So the city wanted to and should have had and continues to have a modicum of control in case somebody thought we were running amok. Suddenly we're borrowing money all over the place because your debt is secondary. What's the correct name? To the
Subordination.
it's subordinated. In other words, if we go bankrupt, you guys are last to the table. We have to pay off all the other debtors, so on and so forth. So the strong interest was, okay, how do we give Nashua control in a sense so that they can feel comfortable that over time they're gonna get their $150.2 million back, of which we're now 12 years into paying back. And we have, 2042, we'll make the last payment to you. It's approximately between the three utilities and a little dividend, about $8.8 million a year to cover the $150.2 million you borrowed at 4.09%. But you get dollar for dollar back, so exactly nothing more, nothing less in the rates. And that was an important commitment so that, because originally it's like, oh, Nashua's gonna get control over the revenues, they're gonna sift off the revenues to pay for fire trucks, and, Trish's new Mercedes-Benz is, head of the Special Water Committee, so on and so forth. So it was very controlled, but so the city as shareholder, one has to approve our board of directors. They don't appoint them. So we have a board of directors who's focused on, getting different skill sets, legal, financial, operational, in our board of directors. That those board members are, placed before the city aldermanic board for approval. They don't get on the board if they're not approved by the city aldermanic board.
That'll be the next meeting.
Right. So, just recently we added Brian Law.
Right.
As a member of our board.
That was
He's a
last
great
year,
guy
yeah.
from an operational perspective. So the board there, we have a board that appoints and finds candidates. They recommend candidates to the city says up or down, but ultimately the city, it's, where I came from before, my board of commissioners at the Augusta Water District in Augusta, Maine, was appointed by the mayor. Mayor said, here are your three commissioners. So there was a strong political tie, and one of the goals in this acquisition was to keep that political tie, to avoid politics from the decision-making process. There was a concern, obviously, by other communities that somehow there might, again, be something, who knows how it would ever happen, that we would focus our investment only in Nashua and not in the surrounding communities, that somehow that would happen. And another reason to stay regulated. Okay, what level of investment are you making? Well, we make investment where it needs to be made, not where people want it to be made. And sometimes they're the same thing, and sometimes they're not. But the structure was set up to do that. It was set up And, you know, our structure is regulated from the perspective, you think about our budget. You know, our board approves our operating budget, but by example, our operating expenses, any expense that is, you know, over $10,000, we're required to go out and seek proposals from vendors to provide copier services, power, chemicals annually, you know, to make sure that our expenses are as tight as they can be. Again, when we go out for debt, we look for the least cost debt, but our rate structure is set into buckets from an educational perspective. When we go in for a rate case, they say, all right, in your revenues that you can collect from your customers, you're allowed to recover dollar for dollar the amount you need to pay the city each year to pay that $8.8 million. And that's divided amongst, for instance, Pennichuck Water Works pays in its revenue requirement has $7.92 million that its share of that 8.8 million. Pennichuck East is like 1.2, and Pittsville Aqueduct's a small number. There was a day I could have told you right to the dollar, but you get older, you forget. Then the second revenue bucket is to pay for our debt service and retirement. So we have approved capital improvements, we're 100% debt financed, and we get the principal and interest associated with those bonds, what we pay each year. And then there's a 10% factor on that because the banks actually wanted us to have a 25% coverage in our revenues to make those payments. Eventually, it was whittled down to a 10% number. That may change in time because the banks have covenants. They want to make sure that we will always have the cash to pay their principal and interest payments. But that's one of the structures we have, and the last is to cover our operating expenses, wages, benefits, power, chemicals. And the PUC reviews those in the year we file rates. So the last rate test year for Pennichuck Waterworks was a 2021 test year. And you have to wait until your books are closed for the year, until they're approved by the PUC. So the middle of 2022, around June, we filed a rate case. And the PUC for that expense column looks at the expenses that you incurred in 2021, says, are they legit? Yep. They'll allow for adjustments. For instance, I'll give you an example, property taxes. So when you invest in plant, property taxes go up, and you may not realize this, but as a point of education, we pay property taxes not only on real property, but on plant and equipment. The desks in our office, the computers in our office are subject to local property taxes less the state component. So, for instance, in the city of Nashua, I think we pay a little over $4 million a year in property taxes to the city of Nashua, and that covers the value of the pipe underneath the ground. You know, when we put in $5 million worth of new pipe this year, and if it was all in Nashua, that $5 million is going to be subject to the millage rate of the city, and it's going to be subject to what's called the statewide education tax. That's $6.60 per thousand. So on average, you know, our property taxes, when you look at our revenue bucket as an expense, is about 18% of what you pay in your rates is to pay property taxes. So, you know, very often for the people in Nashua, it's left pocket, right pocket, because you collect it from us through water rates, we collect it from you from water rates, but that means you don't need it over here out of the tax pocket. But the structure is such that, like I said, we have that component to our rates. That's one of our major expenses. Power, big expense, chemicals, big expense, wages and labor. But all those things are put through the lens of an audit, a very detailed audit by the Public Utilities Commission when we file a rate case. And if there's an expense in there that might be well, that only happens once every 10 years, they'll take that expense out.
Right.
You don't need to recover that, because that doesn't happen year over year over year over year. And so it's a process, and that process takes 12 months. So you file a rate case in June of 22. Generally, they're awarding rates in June of 2023, and those revenues are to cover those buckets we talked about it. But the big thing is you're already behind the 8 ball because they looked at the expenses that are in your revenues, and those were from 2021, it's now 2023.
The, one other thing I just wanted to make a point to, as far as when the creation of Pennachuck under the city is, the first year was the only year that the mayor sat on the board. Since then, the mayor isn't even on the
Right.
board.
There is very specific in the
Right.
bylaws,
Yeah.
board members cannot be, well, and again, that's the other part, so we are obligated to have at least 5 Nashua residents as
Residents.
board members.
Mhm.
Needs to be at least one board member who is a customer, who is within one of the surrounding communities. And then the rest of the slots are what would be called open slots. We are allowed to have up to 13 board members. But it's very clear in the bylaws, no politicians, no former politicians, specifically from the city of Nashua.
So we can't be on the board.
Right.
And I thank you so much, Mr. Ware, for giving that description, because I think a lot of people just don't quite understand how it is, and, they look at Mr. Torres, Mr. Ware, and Mr. Bovair as, these people are just kind of doing and making our rates the way they are, and then they look at the city and saying, why aren't you stopping them? Well, we can't. We can only do so much, but it was a long process to get where we are here. And the biggest comment that I want to make to what was said is that if we didn't buy it, we don't know. There would have been a foreign entity that would
No
have been
question.
owning this, and we would have been obligated to that.
That
The
was-
other,
Sorry,
the-
so 2002, 2003,
yeah,
Freedom Prize,
Yeah.
French company came to buy it. I
yeah,
got
that's when that came out, remember? The other, but the other thing is, there is no other company in the entire country, probably the entire world, that is structured in this manner. This is the most unique structure of a corporation of any kind. So I guess we're on the map for that particular thing, so there's nothing to even compare it to.
Yeah, and it
So
is
we kind of
different.
learned as we've gone
Right.
through this entire process.
We own 64 different public water systems. And when we say public, what happened was for years back in the 1980s and 1990s, developers would build a 60 or an 80 or 100 home subdivision. And they didn't want to do wells and septic because the lots had to be too big. You needed a 75-foot, radius around each well. But if they put in a community water system, reserve some common land, which most subdivisions were required to have, they dropped the wells back there, and they would develop a community water system. They would build it to the state standards, and then the developer would walk off and leave this water system, which for a few years would be fine, but as regulations in particular and water quality changed and became more stringent from 1970, and they continue to this day to get more and more stringent, these little systems were unable, they didn't know how to operate, they didn't, and so what happened is the DES started not approving these systems and said, unless you have somebody who's gonna buy you. Well, from a business perspective, back being a private entity, we were buying these small systems. And again, we spread over 21 different communities. Makes for a lot of windshield time sometimes, It'd be nice if, sometimes to say, oh, if we just had Nashville, but we're dealing with 64 water systems varying as little as 11 customers to as many as the core system is just shy of 30,000 customers, of which a little over 25,000 are in the city of Nashua. But we have a total customer base of around 39,000 customers, and again, about a little over 25,000 are in the city of Nashua. So very unique from that perspective. Typically, a lot of time, especially when you look at systems that are not privately owned, they're all contiguous. You don't drive, 20 miles to get over to Derry to get to the Glen Ridge water system with 88 homes, which requires radon treatment because it has high levels of radon and uranium, interestingly enough. And now with the new PFAS regulations, it's going to require treatment for PFAS. So
We could go on and on and on for this, but based on this, does anybody have any questions? Please, Alderman Jettie.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's
No, please, whatever.
The
This is general
subject of
discussion.
this committee,
Yes.
I'm new, but,
It's okay.
since you brought it up, what about PFAS? Where do things stand with that, and also microplastics?
All right, so couple different aspects there. So let's talk about PFAS first. So very interesting, PFAS, and I'll try to be quick here, was not on anybody's radar map until 2016. And in 2016, under the EPA regulations for the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA is required to go out and monitor for a minimum of 25 unregulated contaminants that they believe may be prevalent in the United States to see if they're present and if they should be regulated. We're currently regulated for 102 different water contaminants. PFAS, the high chain or long chain PFAS, there are 36 different varieties. The one everybody hears about in this area is PFOA or PFAS. So PFAS is what's found, in fire foams. So a lot of small communities are suddenly finding out, if they have small local wells, that their wells are contaminated with PFAS. That's what happened in Portsmouth. They had the airstrip up there, the military airstrip, and 3 of Portsmouth's primary wells, close to 3 million gallons a day, were found to be contaminated with PFAS. And so in 2016, it first came on the radar because that was one of the 4 of those 36 were on that list of 25, and they went nationwide looking for it. But at that time, you could only detect those contaminants at levels down to 20 parts per trillion. And at the time, there was a nationwide health advisory that EPA had established at 70 parts per trillion. Not much was found. Turn forward a couple years, and the ability to detect that level of PFAS or levels went from 20 down to 10 parts per trillion. And suddenly it started showing up. And that's when the state stepped forward and got involved. And the state actually established a state standard for the PFAS contaminants back, I think it was 2021 was when they were finally promulgated, for levels PFOA, 12 parts per trillion, PFAS, 15 parts per trillion, PFX NHS at I think 18, and then there's one at 9. But but in this area, PFOA is very prevalent. So I say prevalent, it's found in the Pennichuck Brook water supply in levels between 30 and 40 parts per trillion. So it has to be treated. It's found in the Merrimack River at levels between 4 and 8 parts per trillion. Well, the current standard of 12, the Merrimack River technically doesn't need any treatment, but Pennichuck Brook does, and it is very expensive to treat. The cost of carbon, if we used Pennichuck Brook exclusively to treat the water, would be north of $2 million a year of additional operating expenses. So it would be about a 5% increase in our expenses. And then the constant, we still don't know when that media comes out eventually where it's going to go. But turning the clock forward, this individual state started regulating for PFAS contaminants. And the federal government did another round of sampling, but now we can detect PFAS contaminants down to between 1.4 and 1.8 parts per trillion. So what used to be a non-detect if you were at 10 is now showing up as 10. And so real concern. There's EPA has not promulgated their final regulation because they're all over the place. It was supposed to be out last March, then December, and now we're hearing that the regulation, which was proposed as 4 parts, PFAS and PFOA, both at 4 parts per trillion, as close to the detectable level as they could be without getting a detection that would be a false flag that could cause communities to literally spend tens of millions of dollars. And then there's a combination of formulas to look at a combination of other entities. That regulation is held up right now. We don't know what's going to happen. So right now we're under the state standard. Everything we have is fully compliant. We are doing more frequent carbon changeouts, and we use the Merrimack River a lot more because it doesn't utilize the carbon up as quickly. That carbon absorbs the PFAS, whether it's at 4 parts per trillion or 40, and it only has so many sites, so many parking spots, and when the parking spots are full, they're full, and then you gotta replace the carbon to have effective treatment. And so we have effective treatment now. We changed the carbon out. It's going, that carbon was originally to remove taste and odor from the water. It's now there to remove PFAS. And the change out of that carbon, total change out $2.1 million in current dollars, was done every 7 years for taste and odor. We're now looking at a change out period of between 1 year and 2 years to change that carbon out.
That's good.
And that will keep us compliant, even if the federal government changes the standard to 4, that'll keep us in compliant with that standard. Up the river, of course, you have the Merrimack Village District. All 6 of their wells were contaminated above the level of 12 parts per trillion. For PFOA, they put in complete treatment up there, which effectively more than doubled their water rates. So it is the contaminant concern. Microplastics are in this next round of, we're currently entering the next round of, it's called UCMR5, so it's the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Regulation, 5th round, 25th year since that requirement happened. They've identified one of the contaminants that are being looked at are microplastics to determine, are they prevalent? If they're prevalent, you know, what is their health effects? And then, you know, based on their health effects, it's just one example and I'm gonna close. If a contaminant is considered a potential carcinogen and you're gonna set a standard for it, you have first of all what's called a maximum contaminant level goal. And if it's a carcinogen, the goal is 0. But what is 0? 0 is non-detect. As I mentioned, you know, in 2016, 0 for PFAS was anything less than 20. It's now actually the newest pass. It looks like they're gonna come out and go from a laboratory process that can see 1.4 to 1.8 down to 0.5 parts per trillion. So the standard, if it's a potential carcinogen, is 0 or as close as practicable. Now you next take into effect, you have to look at treatment technologies, what's available and what's doable, and then they set the standard, so the standard is such that there's treatment that's out there that can be employed. It's quote-unquote affordable, and you can implement that standard. And the goal is, though, is that, you know, originally the standard for cancer was no more than 1 excess cancer death per million people based on somebody drinking 70 liters, or excuse me, 2 liters of water a day for 70 years of their life. And if the result of that, based on the testing, was that that was going to create more than 1 excess cancer death, that was the basis of the standard. But the goal is as close as practicable to 0, and someplace in between, if there's available technology and it's affordable, you may have something that is someplace between the no more than 1 excess cancer death per million, drinking 2 liters of water over 70 years of your life, to non-detect. So it's always changing, you know, there's always new standards being added. PFAS is one of those we're looking at. Microplastics is one of them that's on the horizon. Cyanobacteria is another one that they're looking at closely in this next round.
Good. Just a quick follow-up, is there anything that the homeowner can do in addition to the treatment that you're doing?
So, I mean, carbon's a great catch-all filter. So, you know, lots of people sell carbon filters. They have carbon, but carbon has the effect, it also removes chlorine. So one of the things you want to be very careful about, you put in a carbon filter, it's only good as long as, until all the absorption sites are filled up, so how much water you're taking through it. And because it's removing chlorine at first, the backside of it, it's collecting organics, it's a lovely atmosphere for bacteria to grow. So people leave a carbon-based filter underneath their sink and their refrigerator for more than the recommended, typically they'll say gallons or months, are creating a breeding ground for bacteria because they've removed the chlorine, and chlorine doesn't kill bacteria, it disarms them. Once the little buggers get beyond the chlorine and the chlorine's gone, they go around and they find their weapons again and they're ready to go to work. So chlorine as a disinfectant does not kill bacteria, it disables them. And outside of the presence of chlorine, which is what happens in these small cartridge filters that aren't changed out properly, you get a bacteria breeding ground. So, but those are very effective. Carbon's effective in removing PFAS. Carbon will remove almost any contaminant that's out there within reason. But depending upon the volume of the contaminant and how much water you pass through that filter, it'll tell you how long it's going to be effective for. The water being delivered out into the street meets all the criteria of the Safe Drinking Water Act. All of those 102 contaminants are all monitored for on a consistent basis. People obviously don't feel comfortable, there are standards, so, okay, we have on average 2.3 parts per trillion of PFAS in the finished water. People want to see non-detect. The standard's 12. To get to non-detect, let's say we would have to add 30% to the rate. Some people would say yay, other people are saying, why are we doing this? It's already safe to drink. That's where the personal choice becomes okay. Till further notice, if you want to do that, work with an expert. You want to put in a whole house filter, you want to put in a refrigerator type filter under the sink filter, make sure you understand what it does and how frequently to change it out.
I think Alderman Moran had that
Yes,
same question as Alderman Jettie
I was
did.
gonna make the statement that you're gonna see a lot more whole home filtration systems as, especially if you're, people who are concerned with microplastics that aren't regulated yet. It's a good business to be in, because folks don't want that stuff in their system. But I know of folks who have gotten the whole home filtration, the same thing. The person who's doing the installing is lecturing about cleaning the filters, make sure the filters are up to date.
Alderman Jettie, did you have any more questions, or would you like to, we
No,
can always talk
no,
after the meeting.
Thank you very
too, so-
much for answering all of the questions.
And Don, I
Thank you.
truly appreciated all of that information, and Alderman GOV. I did want to bring one other thing up that I had been talking about, but we will be meeting again on April 10th is the next meeting here. We're not going to meet at 7, we're going to meet at 7:30, and the reason for that is because the infrastructure, joint infrastructure and PD will be meeting at 6, and while I know they do keep their meetings very close to an hour, the kind of mingling, getting them out and so on, and us trying to get in would be too much to ask for all of us as well as, although I'm on that committee, so, but as well as the Pennichuck people. So we've moved it to, and I have spoken to John, and he has agreed to that. And I let Donna know today that we will move that meeting till 7:30. So April 10th is our next meeting, and that's going to be to talk more about, I think we've got to do a proxy card or something, I think, at that meeting. And we can discuss that more. Prior to the meeting, I had brought to Mr. Ware and Mr. Torres, as I was going on, which is why the meeting was almost late, about on social media as well as my getting phone calls, that the water is not optimal to some people. They see it as brown or tinted. Some people said that there's odor to it, and while I don't disagree that that might be, it could be something within their home, is what Mr. Ware was just saying, and not coming in from the pipes. Or it could be at times when I saw very dark water in my house, I swore it had an odor to it, but it could be my brain affecting my nose too, because my eyes were seeing this. In any case, I'm not poo-pooing anybody, but for the public that's listening, for any of the aldermen that read these notes, if that happens and you do see anything, the first line of defense is run your cold water for up to 10 minutes until it is clear. Most of the time, I tell people, do not let it get into your hot water tank, because then you have to get it out. But truthfully, the one time I always see this happening is when I've just run a tub. So I know it's already gone through my hot water heater. Try not to flush your toilet during that time, because you will have the sediment in the back of your tank, obviously. So, but let me, and I know I shouldn't have to do this, but for those that, again, are listening, the next number thing that you should do is you should call Pennichuck. I don't care if it's a weekend, I don't care if it's night, and I am as guilty as anybody of not calling every time it happens. And mine, it happens regularly. Their number is 603-882-5191, And I'll ask aldermen to also let their people know it. Or if you see it on Facebook, please tell them, ask them, have you called? Way back when tenants could not call, the tenants had to go through their landlords. But I believe Pennachuck you've changed the system now that a tenant can actually call and give the address. They are trying to track it. So I know even, members of this board, and I won't name them, I have spoken to that have had this issue. And yes, they did call. Pennachuck has flushed the water hydrants around the home to try to help clear it out. But the problem is sometimes it gets into our house and kind of goes around. But the bottom line, if that happens, and it continues to happen, Pennachuck can work with you. They have pulled my meter, and they pulled a lot of others. They pull your meter, and they flush your entire house to make sure that it's not in there and so on. And for those that say, this is a disgusting, bacteria-ridden type thing, it's not. I believe it's called manganese, and it lines all of our pipes, good or bad. And when there's a large call of water, it makes it fluff off. And then it ends up in our homes when we open up our tap and bring that in. And as Mr. Ware was saying to me prior to the meeting, is that when these pools, I guess you would call them, swarms, pools, whatever you want, it kind of is constantly going through the water system and by luck of a draw. Everything that disturbs the pipes, such as when we're doing streets, when we're going to be doing the sewer work, when the gas company is fixing their pipes are all above Pennachuck's pipes. That will kind of shake them up and make everything move around. So it doesn't take much, and we have very old pipes. One of the things when I had the tour of Pennachuck that I was amazed to see was the wooden pipes that had been on Main Street. And it hadn't been that long since they'd been taken out. And some of our pipes are narrow too. And the more the manganese kind of builds up, and it's not dangerous for you, it just really looks horrible. Truthfully, I wouldn't drink it. I do not have a whole water system in my house, but I do drink the water, I do bathe in the water, and I do cook in the water, and I think it's perfectly fine, and I feel comfortable. And as Mr. Ware stated, when it gets to our house, it meets all the criteria. It may have picked up a little friends on the way called manganese, but it is not bad for us. When we're starting to have an odor and so on, it's probably within our own pipes. So it would not hurt for you to call Pennachuck and kind of talk to them. I could go on, and I usually do about this, but I know that we've been here a long time, and I respect Mr. Torres and Mr. Ware's time as well as the members here. So are there any other questions, comments? Okay. Public comment? Seeing none. Remarks by aldermen? Okay. I guess general discussion went long enough. Mr. Moran, Alderman Moran, do you have a motion?
Yes, I have a motion to adjourn.
Okay, and that is in order, as Alderman O'Brien would often say. All those in favor?
Aye.
And opposed? We don't have Alderman Lopez here to oppose, and the meeting is concluded at 8:18 p.m. And